next topic is rural service centres. A few housekeeping matters before we proceed. First, should the fire alarm sound, the exits are either down the main staircase that you came up, or there is a second staircase which you have to go through the door beyond the first staircase, and there's a door on your right which leads to that alternative exit. And please assemble at the front of the building. I'd ask that your mobile phones are switched to silent or turned off whilst we're in session, please. The hearing was being broadcast by webcam. The camera is in the corner above the door there, just a single viewpoint. Okay. I expect to have a break mid-morning of about 10 minutes and adjourn for lunch at around about 1 o'clock. It's a fairly full agenda today, and I'm anticipating that after some initial discussion about the spatial strategy and the role of rural service centres in that, that most of the morning, if not all the morning, is likely to be taken up with the questions relating to Lenham, and that it's unlikely we'll get to discussion about the other villages until this afternoon. There are a number of invited participants around the table. They're identified by their nameplates, and I ask that when they, although I'll bring them into the conversation at various points, if they want to contribute to discussion at another point, and ask them to put their nameplate up on end, and then I'll bring them into the discussion. The microphones here should explain that although mine can be on kind of all the time, only one other microphone can be working at the same time, and therefore, as soon as you've spoken, I'll ask that you turn the microphone on to speak, and then off as soon as you finish speaking, so that another person can contribute. Okay. Right, so we'll just start by going round the table. Number of new faces here today, and I'll start with the council's side. Perhaps that's not quite a new face to the examination, but Mr. Jarman.
Thank you. Rob Jarman, Head of Planning and Development at Maidstone Borough Council.
Tony Fullwood, Acting for Maidstone Borough Council.
Megan Thomas, Barrister for Maidstone Borough Council.
Councillor Joan Buller, representing Staplers Parish Council.
Michael Smith, JCN Design, representing Sibbon Homes for their site in Headcorn.
Matthew Blyden, DHA Planning, representing Civils Contracting.
David Bedford, DHA Planning, representing Countryside Properties.
Councillors Janetta and Tom Sams from Harwich and Lenham, ward members.
Dr Rebecca Driver, representing Headcorn.
Paul Buckley, CPRE, Kent.
Nick Osborne from Lenham Parish Council.
Mike Cockett, Lenham Parish Council.
Shotter, Lenham resident.
Sandy McKenzie, Lenham Neighbourhood Plan.
Yeah, sorry, it doesn't come on for the last two speakers.
Richard Bate, Green Balance Planning Consultancy, on behalf of Kent Downs Area Outstanding Natural Beauty Unit.
We seem a bit short of microphones today. I don't know if any more are available, but I haven't had to have somebody sharing before. So it is important that you speak closely into the microphone, just so that the webcam recording can pick it up, as well as people at the back of the room. Right. Well, a written agenda was sent out in advance of this session. That sets out the issues around which the agenda is based, and then a number of specific questions put on the agenda after some bit of context. The written statements have been submitted by a number of people in response to those questions, including the Council. And I know when we get to Lenham, the Council wants to explain some changes it's proposing to make to relevant policies, I think, before we get into the wider discussion, because they may address some of the points that people have raised. But before we get to Lenham, there's the first item on the agenda is issue 1, whether the designation of rural service centres is justified as the most appropriate strategy when considered against any reasonable alternatives. Now, this relates to one of the soundness tests, in which one of the considerations of soundness is whether the plan represents the most appropriate strategy for development. Obviously, in previous sessions, the Council has explained its strategy, which is a concentration of development at Maidstone Town, and then other development distributed between the rural service centres as the most sustainable of the rural settlements and with the most facilities, and then a second tier of large villages. And those are all, those three types of settlements are have defined settlement boundaries. Then after that, the smaller villages and the rest of the countryside have much more restrained development policies and aren't being proposed for significant allocations. So this session is specifically relating to the rural service centres, in other words, the second tier of settlements after Maidstone Town. And so the question is really what the role of those should be in the plan. And the large, I think, as it's explained in the agenda, a number of representatives consider that the amount of development proposed in rural service centres is excessive, for reasons which include the amount and distance of travel by residents to the main employment centres, environmental constraints, infrastructure constraints, and the effect on the existing character of the settlements. And I note that many of those who are making those points haven't suggested specific alternative strategies to be pursued instead. So the first question on the agenda concerns that if the level of housing identified in the local plan is confirmed at 18,500 or a similar figure, what reasonable alternative strategy will be preferred by those who oppose the scale of housing development proposed at the rural service centres, and why? Now, in the written statements I've received in response to that, clearly the Council is defending its strategy and giving the reasons why it has proposed the strategy it has. And it points out in total about 28% of all the housing in the local plan is supposed to be allocated to the rural service centres. That's just under, that's just about 3,500 dwellings in total. And the Council says that although they've tried to identify suitable, available and achievable housing sites, but are only able to meet a proportion of the borough's housing needs on brownfield sites, and so they've had to allocate greenfield sites, and they've assessed the sites at the edge of the urban area, in other words, the edge of Maidstone, and the number of allocations there, but they don't consider that there's further capacity at the edge of the area to accommodate those 3,500 dwellings, and so they have distributed them between what they consider to be the most sustainable rural settlements, in other words, the rural service centres. Now, the other responses we've had in writing, Lenham Parish Council have expressed what they consider to be the disadvantages of Lenham as a location for housing development, and their opposition to a dispersed strategy development, which is how it's described. And they consider their preferred alternative would be to create a new settlement close to Maidstone, or otherwise a new town. It says consideration be given to using a new town being planned in enabling authorities such as Ebbsfleet. Alternatively, develop mid-rise buildings near to the town centres. And they also support the idea of developing Detling Aerodrome as a new settlement, which is a location that's been discussed before in sessions, but it is located within the AONB. Now, just were some of the other, just a flavour of the other responses. CPRE consider that greater use should be made of locations within Maidstone town, and they consider that higher densities should be considered at some of the allocated sites. Although I think that the suggested figures don't actually add up to the 3,500, but they would increase the contribution from development in Maidstone. And Headcorn Parish Council considers that development should be concentrated again close to Maidstone town, and they consider that's a more sustainable location than developing at the villages. In responses from some of the developers, I mean, there's either the support for the strategy of rural service centres, and some consider that the rural service centres have more capacity for development than has been identified by the council. Okay. So I'll open up discussion in a moment, but there are I have some supplementary questions which arise out of those representations. I think I put this to those who consider that development there should be a further expansion of Maidstone town, or development close to Maidstone town, in preference to development at the villages. And I'll start with this point about about how that could be accommodated, having regard to, I think, firstly the constraints of the AONB and the motorway to the north, the borough boundary to the west, other constraints such as flood risk in the river valley, and the traffic issues which have arisen in relation to development south and southeast of Maidstone. So first of all, I'll put it to the council first, because obviously they've had to consider this already, about how you could or could not expand Maidstone further, and then I'll ask contributions from other people. Mr. Fulwood.
Thank you, sir. I think you've summarised the issues around Maidstone very well. To the north, as you say, the area of outstanding natural beauty, the council is concerned clearly with its setting, and I know we're coming on to those points in regard to Lenham and other locations, but that is clearly a constraint. The motorway too is something of a barrier in that direction. As you say, to the west, Tunbridge and Malling abut fairly closely, and there is a policy aiming to prevent coalescence between areas in that direction in the plan. And then we have heard there are landscape constraints in other parts around Maidstone where areas of higher quality landscape persist, particularly to the south. And overall, we come back to the issue of traffic congestion, air quality, and the fact that the town is already being expected to accept 64% of the dwelling allocations within the local plan. So it's taking the lion's share in any event, and I think certainly the Borough Council is very much for encouraging brownfield development within the town and trying to focus on the town centre, on the barracks as brownfield locations, and has absolutely tried in every way to bring forward all the brownfield opportunities in and around the town. But it has reached a point where to add further would compound those issues that I just raised. And for that reason, the Borough Council is deciding to move some of the development, as you rightly say, 28%, towards the rural service centres, and I think it's 8% to larger villages. So that seems a reasonable proportion in terms of the sustainability. But it's not just dumping housing on rural service centres. There are clearly two motives here. One is to help sustain those rural service centres through economically and socially, through new provision of housing, through new provision of, in some cases, work opportunities, in some cases sustaining local commercial enterprises and shops and so forth, and sustaining too the community infrastructure. But the second prong is to always ensure that community infrastructure and other physical and green infrastructure follows development to the dispersed locations around the rural service centres. I think that's really the summary of where we've got to from the Borough Council's point of view for now, and I'll come back on more detailed points as they arise. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Driver, Headcorn, I know you've made strong representations about what you consider to be the more sustainable development being close to Maidstone. Do you want to comment on that?
Certainly. I think the problem that I have with development and the use of the term rural service centres is the fact that it's driving behaviours in a way that are unhelpful. We know that language plays a very important way in how people make decisions. There's a very famous paper that dates back to 1981 where two psychologists gave two groups of people identical choices and changed one word, and they got completely the reverse in terms of the choices that were made. And the problem that I have is that the use of the term rural service centres is being seen as at least as good as the urban area when it comes to sustainability. And we know that because if you look at Maidstone's sustainability appraisal, the very first question in there gives equal parity to the urban area and rural service centres in terms of whether you are red, amber or green. They are treated the same. But actually, when it comes to particularly economic sustainability, which plays quite an important role within the NPPF, if you look, for example, at paragraph 17 or paragraph 19 of the NPPF, economic sustainability plays a really key role in how councils are expected to distribute development. You cannot have what is a village being equivalent to an urban area because the way in which their labour markets work and function will be completely different. The key thing in terms of driving growth and innovation is the development of deep labour markets. There's a huge amount of research out there which shows that actually factors such as distance, time, cost, all have a huge impact on how people behave and the barriers that people face in terms of accessing labour markets. The ability to effectively match workers to jobs and jobs to workers relies on having a deep pool of labour available. You can see, if you look at the density of jobs in the 11 wards that make up urban Maidstone, the number of jobs per hectare is 18.69. In the 5 rural service centres, the number of jobs per hectare is 0.62 on average for those wards. There is a fundamental difference.
So just as to how you work that out, you've taken what the parish area or the...
I've taken the ward area because the statistics on jobs by location using the BRES data from the ONS is kind of the lowest I could break it down, was at a ward area. So it is obviously a sort of much wider area, but we know, for example, within Headcorn, several of the major employment sites are significantly outside of the village. For example, Barradales Farm, which is one of the allocated employment sites under both the local and indeed the neighbourhood plan, is, if you were to judge it using the sustainability appraisal approach that Maidstone Borough Council have taken, would be judged as amber compared to the village. It's 1.7 kilometres away from the centre of the village. So we know that actually within rural service centres, employment is in fact quite dispersed. It's not all concentrated in the village itself. If you took the data that I was able to get hold of for Headcorn Parish itself and allocated it all to the built-up area of Headcorn Village, you would still end up with densities that are lower than you see in urban Maidstone. And to give you an idea of the densities, the sort of lowest density within the 11 urban wards is 5.22 jobs per hectare. That's significantly higher than the sort of highest density for the rural service centres, which is for Harrietsham and Lenham, which is 0.89 jobs per hectare. And these types of factor have really important impacts in terms of the economic sustainability of different locations. If you want to promote growth and innovation, then you need to have your housing close to where your jobs are. That, in fact, is government policy. Government productivity policy specifically highlights the fact that to promote growth, houses need to be close to where the jobs are. And this dispersal strategy that Maidstone have employed runs completely counter to that. You see within the rural service centres, they're significantly further than even actually the average for the rest of the rural areas of Maidstone. They are kind of very much on the fringes, and they are all significantly small. The dispersal pattern that Maidstone is employing is very much at odds with the dispersal patterns that are being proposed for significantly larger rural settlements in local plans such as Ashford's emerging local plan, where Tenterton, which is twice the size of Headcorn, is being allocated 175 houses. The Tunbridge Wells local plan, Cranbrook, twice the size of Headcorn, is being allocated 270 houses. It is very much at odds with the sort of dispersal patterns that you typically would expect for rural villages. And the problem that I have is that sort of over the last 3-4 years that I've been involved in Headcorn's neighbourhood plan, there have been a large variety of different planning applications that have come forward in Headcorn. And I started with the top-down approach. What does economic sustainability mean? What does social sustainability mean? Things like, for example, the importance of being close to a secondary school and the fact that that drives children's educational achievements. And if you look at data for England as a whole, only 10% of children travel 6.6 kilometres or more to a secondary school. And even in rural areas in England, only 10% of children in rural areas travel more than 9.4 kilometres to school. In Headcorn, children will have to travel a minimum of 11.4 kilometres to school because that is the closest secondary school. The second closest secondary school is Cranbrook, and children in Headcorn are not eligible to go to Cranbrook because it has an 8.5 kilometre catchment area because it's so popular. So what you see is a dispersal pattern. It's also true that Staplehurst and Marden, for example, as I set out in the representations that Headcorn Parish Council submitted, also you see a significant distance to secondary schools. This matters because it matters for children's ability to acquire the life skills and the education that they need. It's particularly important when you consider that associated with this 28% of housing in rural areas is a 40% requirement for affordable housing. Now, in Headcorn...
we discussed some of these issues before. I don't want to go over the same ground.
Okay.
So can I ask... the question I think I was putting to you is really how, if you don't build in the rural service centres and you say that the expansion of Maidstone is a preferable option, how would that be achieved given the constraints that the Council has spoken about?
Okay, so if you were to rank the sustainability appraisal of sites within Maidstone Borough in the way that I've described in the written representations, so 313 sites, you rank them first by the number of red flags that they have, and then you start looking at the kind of red plus amber to provide within each percentage of red flags, how many problems are you highlighting. What you find is that for Maidstone and Tovel and Luce, which are also part of Urban Maidstone, there are sites which are equivalent to 2,400 homes that were rejected from inclusion in the local plan. In total, I'll just check my figures, but I think it's only around 56.4% of potential housing in the top quartile of the rankings were accepted for inclusion, and only 27.9% in the second quartile was allocated. So if you were to pay much more attention to the actual site rankings within Maidstone's sustainability appraisal, you could end up with a very different dispersal pattern. That's not to say that you wouldn't want any housing in the rural service centres. Obviously, that's not the case. The issue is because the label rural service centres is seen as completely equivalent to being in an urban area, which from a sustainability perspective it clearly can't be, you've ended up with what is a very unbalanced dispersal pattern that does not match the exam question that you've been set, which is to deliver sustainability across the three dimensions of sustainability: economic, social and environmental.
Okay. Staplehurst Parish Council. We'll come to that issue this afternoon. I think that's your specific issue about that. But on the point what we're dealing with now, which is where development should go instead, are you saying you just want to adopt Headcorn's arguments? Is that the case? Okay. Yes. For Lenham, yes.
I have a surplus of microphones now, it would appear. So thank you for your efforts on my behalf. Again, I would like to kind of support the comments of Dr. Driver from Headcorn. I did want to touch on the role of rural service centres, but clearly your question is directed more towards where would the houses go otherwise. You did touch earlier on the point about housing density numbers. You did suggest that there was potential for some, but maybe not.
The CPRE suggested there's potential that.
Yeah, okay. And we did want to echo that point as well. We are in the dark to some extent in terms of Maidstone's own assumptions as regards occupancy of houses and how they are attempting to match future occupancy against the size of dwellings actually to be developed. And we feel that there could be something to explore there. In particular, Mr. Fullwood made the comment in relation to rural service centres about hoping to develop housing and work opportunities. I would want to touch on the point about work opportunities. In the case of Lenham, which has been asked to take about nearly 10% of the total allocation, we basically have a situation where there are 3 employment sites within Lenham. But indeed, given the anticipated increase in population from over 1,000 houses in Lenham to perhaps as much as 2,800, there's no provision being made for new employment opportunities. And I would suggest that any investigation into where employees employed in Lenham come from will actually show very readily that the 2 largest sites in Lenham source their employees from outside Lenham Parish, and in some cases, particularly in relation to the Marley sites, from some considerable distance, perhaps outside Maidstone Borough, in actual fact. So I think there is investigation required as to how best to locate development close to employment sites, which is one of the goals of the Borough Council.
And the CPRE.
Thank you, sir. Just really want to add to what I've said before and in response to some of the proposed modifications by the Borough Council. When we talk about the potential to increase density within allocated sites within the town centre, that's within the existing urban area and, just for clarification, does not include sites allocated on the northwest and southeast strategic development locations, some of which have obviously been permitted. Now, I note that the the council in PC 78 proposes increasing sort of dwelling numbers from town centre sites from 700 to 990, so that increases to 90 and reduces the need for rural housing. PC 79 is now suggesting that the H111 Springfield Royal Engineers and Mill Lane allocation is increased to 692. That increases dwellings by 192. And that, again, increases housing within the town centre, well located in that instance to the railway station and the centre itself, and obviously would help to underpin the vitality and viability of the town centre in the evenings and at weekends. What that does, it raises its density to 180 dwellings per hectare, which, if I was to use the EBSLEET implementation framework recent consultation document, in which on page 77 they have a illustrative typical block structure diagram, that would be apartments at a high city level density, probably, as I would think, appropriate to such a location. The Invicta Barracks, which is directly opposite, and the southern end is a similar distance away from the town centre, is a 41 hectare site, and the plan suggests the site can be allocated for up to 1,300 dwellings. That implies density of just 32 dwellings per hectare, which is very low suburban density and probably would be provided by a mix of semi-detached and short terraced developments. Given its proximity to the town centre, this seems to be not the best use of an urban site. And therefore, even if you just doubled the density, and I've not done any figures, so I'm not sure about the ability to put on site, but given its proximity to town centre and Sandling Road, that could double the numbers on that site and still have 63 per hectare, which is still low density compared to the other sites. Putting high density on those sites would also be inconsistent with the council's vision, which, council's vision for the greater use of walking, cycling and public transport. Again, that would help it. And then again, we have Moat Road is now coming forward as much more of a housing element rather than just office. So from that point of view, so there are opportunities to increase housing within the existing town centre on existing allocations, which obviously would then reduce the need for housing at the rural areas. And given that quite a number of sites in the rural service centres have already been permitted, that may actually square the circle. And just to pick up on Dr. Driver's point regarding schooling, obviously within the town you have a mix of secondary schools, grammar, academies and the like, which you don't have at rural service centres, which obviously means that children can attend school, take part in after-club activities and benefit from all that secondary education can offer them for their future life. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I'll just take the OMB, then I'll ask the Council to come back on some of these points.
Thank you, sir. One very brief and specific point on behalf of the AONB unit, if I may. I should preface my remarks by saying clearly it's not our job to do the spatial planning of Maidstone Borough on the Council's behalf, and we have no desire to get involved in that. Our interest is specific to do with the protection of the interests of the area of outstanding natural beauty. But we just want to assess the allocation of 1,500 houses or thereabouts to Lenham in one particular way, and it's this. If I can read out one couple of sentences from the submission the Council made, it's at 7.15.3 to today's session. It says the Borough Council is aware there is still local objection to where substantial additional housing may best be achieved at Lenham. To date, the evidence collected by the Council illustrates that sufficient land is available to deliver the quantum of housing proposed, along with the necessary supporting infrastructure. Well, if that was the case, we'd be very happy, and if the AONB could be protected in doing that, that would be satisfactory from an AONB perspective. But as things stand, we are not satisfied that such evidence, as is claimed, hasn't actually been presented. And what we don't want to do is get in a position where the Council is presenting 1,500 houses into Lenham and then subsequently finding there's a problem of actually absorbing them in relation to the AONB. So the process ought to have been the other way around, ensuring that the houses could be absorbed before accepting 1,500, and that might have suggested, if it couldn't, that houses might need to be distributed elsewhere. There's a lot of Maidstone which isn't affected by the AONB. Thank you.
Okay, well, we've got a number of questions later to address about Lenham and its relationship with the OMB specifically. But can I ask you, while we're on this subject of alternative locations, Lenham Parish Council and other people, including the coordinating team of various parish councils and Kent Association local councils, and the County Council in its 2014 representations, all suggested a better location for developing would be Detling Aerodrome, and we've had a session earlier in the session in the hearings where developers seeking to develop a major settlement at Detling, including housing and new employment and sports facilities and country park and various other things. Can you just have the view of the AONB unit on the comparison between developing within the AONB at a site like Detling, or developing adjacent to the AONB at a site like Lenham or Woodcut Farm?
Thank you, sir. as you know, planning is an activity where you never say never. But the position with Detling airfield is fairly straightforward. As you've identified, it's within the area of outstanding natural beauty in its entirety, and the general presumption would be that this wouldn't be the first place you would start to look to accommodate developments, whether housing or industrial developments or anything else you had in mind. So that the A&B unit is pleased to see that the site is not allocated in the plan at the moment, and on that basis we haven't got particularly involved in considering it in detail. But the general idea is that we would expect to resist that. Having said that, clearly the reason for the designation of the AONB is primarily to do with the scarp of the North Downs and the views from it, and that has been instrumental in generating our presence here this week to discuss Lenham, Woodcut Farm, Newnham Park and one or two others. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Jarman, then, could you come respond to the various points being made?
Just on the last point made by Mr. Bate, certainly at Maidstone Borough Council, we seek to protect and enhance all of the area of outstanding natural beauty, the scarp slope and the dip slope, part and parcel of the same escarpment. So I find it very strange, the comments just made by Mr. Bate. However, my general point is, as I've said earlier at this examination, clearly the town centre is at the top of our tree in terms of proactively seeking development to take place in and around the town centre. And in principle, as you know, Mr. Mello, we seek higher densities in relative terms. However, I wouldn't underestimate the challenge in the town centre. It's one can look at it quite simplistically. Oh, the town centre is the most sustainable location. Yes, it is. But if we pick on Springfield, for instance, the northern part of the allocation, whereby a company called U&I have submitted a high-density residential application. On that site is what's called the Mansion House, designed by Alfred Waterhouse. So it's not just a matter of protecting the listed building itself, but its setting. The setting looks out onto the River Medway. Clearly, in and around the town centre, in terms of numbers, that's where we have most of our heritage assets. Again, the barracks, for instance, there's a listed property called the Park House, which is on a hill there, but it's the setting as well. So I wouldn't underestimate the challenge of accommodating the right layouts in and around the town centre. Thank you.
It's on the barracks. I mean, we heard yesterday that the Ministry of Defence is going to release the barracks site, and the date that there was announced, I think it was from 2027. I mean, that gives rise, or perhaps exacerbates what may already is been an issue, which was the delivery rate on that site. However suitable it is and however many dwellings you can accommodate on there in total, how many can actually be built within the planned period? Because if the site isn't vacated till 2027, even if the CPRE correct and you could double the density on there, how would that help in the local plan? Because how many could you deliver in the planned period?
You make a good point, because clearly the Borough Council is very pleased to have heard the announcement, and that then therefore brings into play potentially 1,300 dwellings, the local plan says. The local plan says these would come on stream from 2026. The Ministry of Defence announcement says that the release will be from 2027. We're seeking further clarification with our contacts at the Ministry of Defence in terms of phasing to bring any further information to you, because there has been some announcement that at the same time the report says that these dates will be reviewed annually and as decanting and so forth. I guess programmes change and so on. So we're just seeking clarification before we confirm the position of the Borough Council upon it. Your broader point about if you double the number, it doesn't mean to say that during the plan period it would be successful in delivering that other half, the other 1,300, if you want to call it that, during the plan period. So it wouldn't necessarily help meeting objectively assessed needs in the plan period.
Okay. About Headcorn's points then about the sustainability of the rural settlements as locations, having regards particularly to proximity to employment and to secondary education.
I think we'll have to deal with it in several ways. To deal with it directly, in terms of access to employment, all rural service centres have sustainable transport options, including a railway service. So, for example, Lenham can, 15 minutes to Ashford, 15 minutes into Maidstone. If you're into Ashford, you can get into London within 40 minutes. Other Headcorn, Staplehurst, Marden, all on the train to London in and around an hour's time. And not necessarily London, of course, Tunbridge and Paddock Wood and other places of employment. That's looking at the transport connections. In terms of local opportunities, the Borough Council is aware that there are local opportunities for employment. We've heard about Lenham's 3 major employment sites. Other locations, Staplehurst, Marden, have significant employment opportunities on the doorstep. There will never be a hermetically sealed, everybody lives and works in the same place. People have choices to make and travel. Nevertheless, the opportunities are there to have local employment. New primary schools that come with infrastructure will bring local employment. Sustained shops bring local employment. For all the houses that will need servicing and maintenance and cleaning and gardening and all the rest, bring some local employment. The building trades themselves during the phasing of development will bring local employment. So there are opportunities existing, proposed in 2 rural service centres, further employment opportunities. The Borough Council seeks to protect those and indeed intensify them and so forth. So there are local opportunities. In terms of schooling, yes, the choices, I would say, are more limited at rural service centres. There are primary schools local to each one of the rural service centres, but secondary schools is a more complex picture these days with different types of secondary school being created, some out with the local authority control these days. Lenham certainly has the secondary school, and again, that's one of the reasons for the focus at Lenham. Others will have to travel to school, which is not untypical of rural service centres. Again, there are sustainable modes of transport available, and it's not uncommon for school children from these areas to have to travel some distance. But I would come back to the bigger picture, which we started with, which there isn't, in our view, more capacity at the town to absorb significantly greater development, which would result from reducing the numbers at rural service centres. And so sustainability is about a rounded decision about environmental factors, about social factors, about economic factors. And when a rounded view is taken, then these settlements certainly score well and are capable of achieving the numbers that the Borough Council puts forward in its local plan.
Ms. Schotter first, because you were asked first.
Okay, the issue of secondary schools. If you think that rural secondary schools are such a wonderful opportunity that Lenham then can be asked to put 1,500 houses in, why didn't you create another rural secondary school in one of the other rural service centres? You will have a lot of income. And I don't mean that now that there should be more housing in other rural service centres. What I mean is it would relieve a lot of traffic in town, wouldn't it? How many cars are travelling every day from the southeast to Maidstone for educational purposes? Number one. Number two, Detling Airfield. I just want to clarify that the Lenham statement does not foresee housing on Detling Airfield. We were just considering using the brownfield site for warehouse purposes, which warehousing, which the council wants to allocate on Junction 8. Okay, the Detling Airfield site is ideally located for warehouse purposes, also traffic-wise, and warehousing doesn't require many employees, so there wouldn't be much travelling from and to work. Thank you.
Ms. Mackenzie.
Thank you. Mr. Fulwood made reference to, in the case of Lenham, it having a station 15 minutes to Ashford, 40 minutes into London. 15 plus 40 adds up to 55, but life's not quite as easy as that. In actual fact, there's a drive to Ashford, there's parking at Ashford. In actual fact, the journey time into London, as somebody who has made that on many occasions, is actually getting on for an hour and 20, hour and 30 by the time you arrive anywhere. It's really not a lot better than the actual rather slow stopping service from Lenham at the end of the day. So I don't think it's quite as easy as actually saying it's got a station, therefore one can travel. The Economy Group within the Lenham Neighbourhood Plan conducted a survey of Lenham businesses in 2015. It identified perhaps 1,600 employment opportunities within Lenham. At the time, and not surprisingly, a significant number of these opportunities occurred at both Lenham Storage and on the Marley sites owned by AliAxis. Both employers reported that the vast number of their employees, either because of particular skills, in the case of AliAxis, perhaps science manufacturing-based skills in the case of Lenham Storage, the ability to drive HGVs, to be honest, resulted in the vast majority of their employees commuting into Lenham Parish to take up employment opportunities every day. And the vast number of Lenham-based employees commuted out of Lenham every day for employment purposes. And in virtually all cases, 98% were reported in our survey as journeying out of Lenham by car. So we find no evidence based on our own Economy Group survey that either employees commuting into London or employees commuting into Lenham or employees commuting out of Lenham makes any significant use of rail or bus services. Now, that's not to say that perhaps rail transportation cannot be improved in the future, but it hasn't moved very much and it's gone backwards in my time in Lenham. Thank you.
But does that mean that then you should disregard whether somewhere has rail or bus services when you locate development? If you're saying everyone's going to use a car anyway, you put them anywhere in the countryside.
Well, indeed, you could disregard that totally, but given one of the purposes of sustainability is to try and minimise car journeys, then in allocating housing close to sources of employment would actually make much more sense, surely.
Or close to a sustainable means to get there. I mean, people may not use cars now. If congestion gets worse, if costs go up, there are all sorts of things which affect people's choice of how they travel. And if they can travel from somewhere with a station, is that better than if they're travelling somewhere where they haven't got that opportunity?
I think we're delving into theoretical situations, but ideally you would want people to travel by station. You wouldn't necessarily want people to be forced into a situation where, because of economic circumstance, they were forced onto trains, because most people are probably using cars for their journey simply because in terms of their quality of life, it may be an unpleasant mode of transport in terms of getting to work, but it might be better than the alternatives available.
I want to move on to Lennon Proper shortly, but we'll just take a couple more comments here from Rebecca Driver first, and then CPRE.
I think there are two things mixed up in Mr. Fulwood's comments. One is the sustainability of the mode of transport, and one is the economic sustainability associated with promoting strong labour markets. It's very clear from government evidence that in rural areas, productivity growth is substantially lower than in urban areas. So even if you strip out London, which is obviously exceptional, productivity in rural areas is 7% lower than it is in urban areas. And one of the reasons for that is because while there is undoubtedly employment in rural areas, it is much harder for firms to find the right workers and for workers to find the right jobs. One of the reasons that so many people are likely to be commuting backwards and forwards from Lenham is because matching is a tough thing. So if you've only got a very small labour market to play in, the likelihood of you finding the right job is much lower. In terms of the sustainability of the mode of transport, I'd like to refer you to Table 2 of the Regulation 19 submission that Headcorn Parish Council made to give you some sense as to why actually supposedly sustainable transport options are unlikely to be chosen. I haven't done the same analysis for the other rural service centres, but I'd be very surprised if they were that different. So Maidstone, which is our closest urban area, in order to arrive at your desk by 9 o'clock, you'd have to leave the centre of Headcorn at 1 minute to 8. Now, the drive time is estimated to be between 24 and 35 minutes. So there is a very strong reason why people are going to pick driving in a car, because time is very valuable to people. If you look at the two closest, not the two closest, but the two urban areas where actually you can get a train and leave after 8. One is Ashford, that's 5 minutes past 8, and one is Tonbridge, that's 9 minutes past 8. They're the only two urban areas where that's the case. You are still looking at, if you look at...
Sorry, where are you going? Are you going to London? Are you going to Maidstone?
So if from Headcorn you want to get to Ashford,
right,
you have to leave at 5 minutes past 8 from the centre of the village. If you want to get to Tonbridge, you have to leave at 9 minutes past 8. So if you look at the census data for the number of commuters going to these destinations by train, despite the fact that they're the two urban areas where you can leave after 8, it's less than 6% of commuters in the case of Tonbridge, I think, or sort of, it's less than 6% in both cases and less than 2% in one case. So you can get there by train.
Less than 6% of what?
Of commuters going to these destinations choose to use the train.
Right, 6% of commuters from
Headcorn
use the train to go to Ashford.
To go to Ashford or Tonbridge, despite the fact it's a direct train link and you could leave after 8, albeit only just.
What's the reason for this 8 o'clock cut-off? Because, I mean, if people, for example, people commuting to London, I think would usually anticipate leaving before 8 o'clock. And yet Headcorn seems to be a popular place for people to commute to London.
Because, well, Headcorn, in fact, if you look at the commuting patterns for those going to from Headcorn to London, 23% of them travel by car. So actually, just because there's a station and you can get to London... And
how many travel by train? 77%, presumably, then?
Travel by train, I think in total it's about 14%. Whether all of those are going to London or not, I'm not sure.
So you're mixing figures up here. You said that 23% of people who go to London go by car.
Go by car.
Right. So 77% go by train?
That may be the case, but in total, 14% of commuters from Headcorn use the train. So it's a relatively small proportion.
So 14%?
14%.
Yeah. But obviously it's a busy station, so people come from, I mean, I think we've heard in other representations, people drive from Lenham to Headcorn because they get a better rail service.
That's true, but that doesn't mean that if you put more housing in Headcorn, those people will choose to move to Headcorn, because there are other things, there are other factors that decide people's choices, including the probability that their spouse will get a job, the location of schools, and particularly secondary schools, for example. There are lifestyle choices that people make. A lot of people may like to live in the middle of nowhere rather than in a village. And so you do get commuting patterns within rural areas. But the idea that if you allocate more housing to Headcorn, that will automatically mean all the people who are commuting from Headcorn who don't live in Headcorn will move there is clearly false. If you look at the 2011 census data, the number of vacant properties in Headcorn at that stage for the parish as a whole was 6.8%. For the village, it was 7.6%. The average for Maidstone was 3.4%. Now, that is not all because of second homes. If you look at the census data for 2001 as a comparison, although it doesn't break out the parish level versus the built-up area of the village, for the parish as a whole, vacant properties were 2.7%. So there was a really significant increase in the number of vacant properties following the building of 200 properties within the village. And if you look at commuting patterns comparing 2001 census data and 2011 census data for Headcorn, what you find is that with the increase in the number of properties, to sort of 200 extra properties, precisely 2 extra people now use the train. So this idea that because you've got a station, everybody's going to commute by train because it's a station with a link to London, everybody's going to commute to London, that's actually not the case.
In your evidence gathering for the neighbourhood plan, have you any figures on the proportion of people who've moved into the village who come from within the borough compared to outside the borough, for example, or people who've moved from London, or any of those sort of figures? Have you looked at that, where people have actually coming from?
We have data looking at how long people have lived in the village, and I don't have that in my head, but I can look that up for you and come back to it.
But does that include where they came from?
It doesn't include where they came from. No, it's just from outside the village. A couple of other things that I'd like to bring up. One of the things was that in terms of employment and the need for extra workers to be located in Headcorn to support jobs, we surveyed, like Lenham did, we surveyed the local business community, and the proportion of businesses citing either housing or the availability of skilled or unskilled workers as a constraint on their future expansion was very, very limited. In contrast, the number of businesses citing things like sewage capacity as a constraint on expansion was extremely significant. It was 60% of the sample. So the need for workers in Headcorn is not, I think, a constraint on expansion. Just a couple of things on the school point.
If we can move on, because I think we're getting a long way from these questions, and because the question was about where else development should go, and this is all about, why development shouldn't go in Headcorn. Okay. See very quickly, then I want to get on to Lenham, because we've got lots of issues about Lenham.
Thank you, sir. Just really, first with Lenham, obviously if you look at the 2011 census information on economically active residents aged 16 to 74 who are in employment, then 8.5% travelled to work and 1% went by bus, which indicates that the public transport, is not a popular mode. That may well reflect the fact that the bus goes every hour and goes from Ashford to Maidstone and goes through all the villages. With the train, it will take you just to Maidstone and Ashford. And again, it's on the south side of the village, furthest away from where most of the people live. Again, possibly a guide, I don't know, as to why they may use that. Thus, people go by car from the villages, possibly to Maidstone. Looking at the council's air quality information, the junction at the Wheatsheaf Public House, junction of Luce Road and Sutton Road.
We're going to have a lot about the Wheatsheaf at other sessions, aren't we? Yeah.
But if I may just add the point, sir, that is at or above the EU level for NO2 pollution. Additional cars may well make that worse, to which should be considered the last week's Client Earth's High Court case, which came down in their favour. I haven't had time to read all of it, but they, in their summing up, that is Client Earth, say, in his judgment, Mr Justice Graham ruled that the government's 2015 air quality plan failed to comply with the Supreme Court ruling or relevant EU directives, and said that government had erred in law by fixing compliance dates based on over-optimistic modelling of pollution levels. That will have an impact, sir, on the development and the impact of development on air quality and meeting those guidelines.
Well, that sounds like a strong argument for placing development where people can walk to the bus or the railway station, and then you find ways to reduce their use of cars.
Where they use the bus, sir. And that comes back to the point of, do people in rural service centres travel by public transport? And how would you improve that to make that a regular service rather than a one-hour service? That's a cost. If I may just come back now, sir, to Invicta Park Barracks. When I mentioned doubling the capacity, that was, in a sense, a hypothetical question. Obviously, I'm aware that you would have to do a reasonable survey of the site to see just how much density could go on there. It may be more, it may be less. Coming back, basically, to the Ministry of Defence statement yesterday, obviously, I'm assuming, and I may be assuming wrongly, that when they dispose of the site, they will dispose of it with some form of planning permission, some form of development plan or development strategy, and rather than just sell it as an empty site. I'm sure the government would wish to maximise its profit from such a sale. And then coming down to basically how much land could be developed in the planned period. It's a large site, and if the economy is right, I see no reason why you should not get a fair number of sites out of that on an annual basis. Particularly if the site is subdivided into smaller units, 50 units, they can come forward quite quickly. And that is, I think, something that needs to be thought about as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
Last one on this point, then we'll move on to Lenham.
Yes, yes, Inspector, I only want to make a short point to pick up on what Tony Forward said about rural service centres being good transport hubs. Yes, we have the railway line, but getting into Maidstone, either by bus or car, especially at peak times, is extremely difficult because a lot of the development is all in this southern corner, and everything's got to feed into Maidstone. And our children going to secondary schools in Maidstone or beyond Maidstone, on the other side of Maidstone, are often regularly late, even though they have left our parish soon after 7 in the morning. So the roads are gridlocked, and we have cited this from the beginning, and I just implore you to consider that when you look at any other extra sites. Thank you, Inspector.
Okay, we'll move on then to Lenham. And the first issue for Lenham is whether the designation as a broad location for 1,500 dwellings is justified, effective and consistent with national policy. Well, we have the written statements from the Parish Council and the Neighbourhood Plan Group, and essentially they say they disagree that it's sound on those bases. They make points concerning the sustainability and talk about the sewage works and capacity as an important thing. Landscape, obviously, an important issue there. Agricultural land quality and the fact that it's a greenfield site rather than there will be greenfield land rather than brownfield sites. But I think before we get into discussion on this, I know that the Borough Council wants to explain the changes which it's proposing to make to relevant policies for Lenham, and I'll ask them to do that.
Thank you, sir. Following the expiration of the broad location master planning exercise, the Borough Council has confirmed at a previous hearing that it's open to Lenham being designated as a broad location without dictating the sites which must be found only on the east and west of the settlement. So this opens up the options of south as well as east and west of Lenham, and even part of the 2 major employment sites if they are available and where the overall employment capacity of the sites is maintained. The Borough Council proposes to formalise this position as a proposed amendment to both in terms of the maps included within the plan, the policy text and the supporting text. This includes proposing to amend Policy SP8 to ensure that major development in the AONB and coalescence with Harrietsham is avoided. The Borough Council considers that after 2 appeals, west of Ham Lane and Goods Yard sites, that there's a residual requirement of at the broad location of 1,350 dwellings. And concern has been expressed by yourself, sir, we've recognised, but also the development industry, that achieving that number in the last 5 years of the plan period may be challenging However, there remains a need, in the Borough Council's view, to determine the optimal distribution of residential development, the primary school and green infrastructure, to assess transport's impact of development, particularly to the south, where that hasn't been undertaken to date, to the south of the railway line, and to secure programmed improvements to the sewage treatment works. So there's some more work to be done in terms of the detailed distribution around Lenham. The Borough Council wishes to continue to build on the master planning exercises with local stakeholders, including the Parish Council, the AONB unit, Kent County Council in its role as Highways Authority and Education Authority, and landowners and developers. Following this work, there is a need in statute to allocate sites in a development plan. And the Borough Council is flexible about how this can happen, as to whether it's through the Lenham Neighbourhood Plan or a Lenham Development Plan document produced by the Borough Council. But again, it's hoped in liaison with the aforementioned group. If a development plan document, the Borough Council would arrange to adopt the plan by December 2019 and is proposing formal amendments in the local plan to reflect this. And it would also need to propose formal amendments to its local development scheme to reflect this point too. So subject to timely infrastructure provision, in particular the primary school, transport measures and sewage treatment works, this gives a much greater period for development of the 1350 new homes. So that's a summary of where we have. I haven't introduced in every detail the specific changes to every policy, but it's the overarching position which the Borough Council takes to this session on Lenham.
Right. So and also there are a couple of papers which have been produced which are relevant to the sewage treatment issue, I think, which was mentioned there. There's the Council's response to action points that goes out of session 1, and particularly, I think it was particularly in response to matters raised by Ms Shotter at that time in relation to groundwater and sewage treatment. And the Council produced a paper about that. And then also for this session, there's a situation statement concerning the Borough Council's understanding of the position in relation to Southern Water and the sewage treatment capacity there, and the expectation, I think, that if the board allocation is confirmed in the local plan, that would give Southern Water sufficient confidence to put forward a scheme for enhancing the sewage treatment in this would be the 2019 to 2024 period, that kind of work starting within that period to expand the sewage treatment works. Okay. Ask Ms Shott about the sewage treatment matter in the moment. Does the Parish Council, first of all, wish to just do an initial reaction to what the Council's proposed changes? Who's going to do this? Ms Cockett? Okay.
Much as a conversion on the road to Damascus by the planning department here is welcomed in Lenham, you won't be surprised to know that there's a fair degree of scepticism about the motives and the method by which some of these changes are going to be applied. The one significant thing which the people of Lenham, and I still have my 2,300 petitions present, if you would like to examine them, sir. But the one common thing between us in Lenham, the parish council, the parish council and the people, is the determination not to build on the heritage viewpoint to the east of the village, which is already identified by the council as a site to be developed.
We're talking about Tanyard Farm now.
We are talking about Tanyard Farm.
We've got separate questions on Tanyard Farm. I'd like to stick to the broad location principle as well. Yes.
But the one thing that I suggest that the council needs to do to establish credibility is to give an undertaking that there will be no attempt to slip a planning permission through the back door before your report is done, sir.
Can I ask you for a current application on that site?
There isn't a planning application, but there have been a number of pre-application discussions. In direct response to Mr. Cockett's central point, then the draft policy on Tanyard Farm has helped us in discussions with the would-be developer, in that we are asking for a clear vista of the Remembrance Cross to be created and framed. And it would be sent, as I understand it, it would be centred around both sides of the existing public right-of-way. A vista would be created because the public right-of-way continues to the north and the cross is slightly to the west of that north-south axis. So that would be a central part of any acceptable layout.
Well, I mean, that's a useful comment, but I want to stick to the broad principles at the moment first, and before we get on to specific sites like that. So, Mr. Mackenzie, back to you later.
Thank you. I think we would agree that, and this is all subject to whether Lenham is designated as a broad location at the end of the day. But as things stand at the moment, we would agree that the delivery of 1,500 houses over a 5-year period does not seem a tenable proposition. If it were necessary to deliver 1,500, 1,350, whatever the number is, then some phased development would make more sense. We welcome the consideration of development south of the railway. We would strongly urge that if that were to be pursued, given that there is one planning application that was won on appeal at the goods yard, given that there are essentially 2 landowners of significance south of the railway, both of whom I should say, have indicated that their land is available, and both of whom have indicated that they would be amenable to an integrated development which allows for some form of spine road, link road, south of the railway, by which traffic could be channelled away from the centre of the village and perhaps through effective traffic planning onto Ham Lane or through some other thoroughfare that was established to the west of Ham Lane. We would strongly urge that, to the extent I understand master planning, that such an integrated approach to south of the railway would be essential to getting the neighbourhood plans or neighbourhood plan's approval or the parish council's approval. And indeed, to the extent that any further development took place west of Ham Lane, I think that one should be looking for that to be integrated within an overall plan. We certainly welcome the fact that there is a willingness to consider land that may become available at brownfield sites within the parish, and we are aware and have been in touch with landowners who acknowledge that there is land within such sites which has been out of use for some time and with no prospect of coming into use. Nevertheless, we recognise that such businesses have commercial sensitivities. They have employees to cater for. They're not really keen on setting hares running. So I think discreet conversations are necessary with such employers to establish what is possible there. As has been alluded to before, that's all very well if a broad location is decided upon for Lenham. We still have great concerns about the ability to deliver sewerage and wastewater treatment within the village, and we'd need to be convinced of that. And backing up on Mr. Cockett's point, it is not just the viewpoint to the cross which is an influencer on our view on the east. There are a number of other significant considerations which the gentleman from Kent AONB has articulated within his statement at great length, which we'll be looking to support also. Within all this, it is within Maidstone's spatial portrait the case that it seeks to maintain the distinct character and identity of villages and to protect the built and natural heritage, including the AONB and its setting. So we would be very keen to explore with them how they would seek to achieve that. Thank you.
Ms. Schotter, yes.
The exploration of the broad location in Lenham comes 2 years too late. This is the job which you should have done 2 years ago, especially with regard to wastewater. There's very clear planning guidance that this should be happen at the outset, at the plan scoping and evidence gathering stages and plan making. I'm not aware that this has happened. We are now 2 years in, and you still don't have a promising wastewater strategy for Lenham. That is basically, for the time being, my main point. How can you put 1,500 houses into a location, put 2 stars on either side, and you don't know very much about this place? You have not explored this location before you have allocated Lenham to take 1,500 houses. Yes, the aspect of the environmental license. We are not concerned about Southern Water and their investment. They have to invest, we all know that. We are concerned about the environmental license, which they don't have, at least at the moment, as far as we know. The environmental license for Lenham is quite a problem because we are sitting on a watershed. We are getting our water from the Thames catchment basin, and we are exporting our water to the East Kent River Basin. This is major stuff that has to be recognised in the management plans for the water catchment, for the basin catchment plans. The next plan is due in 2021. So the Ofwat plan in 2019 is not really relevant because overriding is the task which was set by the government to the authorities to get the rivers into a good status. Everything falls under that. So it's not about pricing, not about Southern Water, it's about the environmental license. And you have, in my opinion, not engaged early enough to secure such an environmental license. The last management plan for the river basins was issued in 2015. You had 1 year beforehand, at least 1 year beforehand, to make them aware that you need a license for Lenham.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, broadly speaking, I agree with what Mr. Mackenzie said, and we look forward to working constructively with the Parish Council. I agree as well that there is a lot of work to be done on the master plan. As Mr. Mackenzie said, there's clearly a need to perhaps have a new bridge or to expand the existing bridge across the railway line to unlock development to the south, and also to link up any southern development with the centre of Lenham, which is towards the northeast, some distance from the south. There's issues to do with where a two-form entry primary school goes, plus the playing fields. Lots of issues to be sorted out. But specifically with regard to what Ms. Schotter said, of course, we have been working with Southern Water right throughout the evolution of the local plan. We work very close with them on planning applications, but to date, we haven't been able to get a threshold from Southern Water in terms of what number house triggers the expansion of the existing wastewater treatment works. It's unfortunate that we have not to date been able to agree a statement of common ground, but you should have, Mr. Mellor, a situation update on progress to date. Just as it was a small point, but as time goes by, it's gaining weight. I am conscious that, again, Mr. Mackenzie referred to one of the appeal decisions, the old goods yard, but as you know, there was one on Ham Lane, and there will be other decisions, dare I say it, in the next 12 months. Thus far, Southern Water are not objecting to planning applications, or indeed asking for Section 106 monies.
Okay, Countryside Homes, you've got an interest in land to the west of Lenham. Have you done any investigation about what may be infrastructure constraints in relation to wastewater capacity?
Thank you. In simple terms, no. I think certainly at this stage we can't offer too much more in terms of the infrastructure capacity, beyond our view that we don't think it's an absolute constraint to development coming forward at this stage. I'm conscious of areas such as Hailsham, Denham Wilden, where wastewater capacity constraints are such that no development can take place, but that's all to do with the habitat regulations and discharge into Pevensey levels, etc. And I'm not aware that there's any particular issues beyond the fact that there needs to be proper plans put in place for the future growth and capacity for Lenham. But in simple terms, we see no reason why development can't come forward earlier, or at least sites be allocated now, subject to conditions that wastewater capacity has been addressed. I think it's important to say that we're not at odds with Maidstone on this broad strategy, the 1,500 unit growth of Lenham. But we are particularly concerned about the delivery or the lack of delivery and the leaving it till either the neighbourhood plan comes forward or until such time as a separate DPD is prepared. again, going back to the tests of soundness, it's to be justified, her plan has to be the most reasonable, or it should be the most appropriate strategy when faced with all reasonable alternatives. And we can't see that the Council has got this absolute barrier that stops them identifying sites now. We've touched on earlier sessions that we think sites in Lenham need to start being delivered immediately within 5 years for the purposes of the 5-year housing supply situation. And again, I come back to that point because if sites don't come forward quickly and sufficient land isn't allocated and policies for the supply of housing quickly go out of date, then quite simply we're just going to have planning by appeal anyway. So I advocate, or we advocate, positive planning. We think it's necessary to identify sites now, and we're yet to see any firm evidence. I mean, Mr Jarman's just said himself that Southern Water aren't objecting to planning applications coming forward at this point in time. So until we see evidence that there is such a constraint that sites can't be allocated, then there needs to be firm allocations within this plan as drafted to take it forward and make this element of the plan sound. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you have an estimate of how many dwellings your site could accommodate?
Up to 600.
Mr. John, I was just going to ask on this point about you didn't mention the Environment Agency licence. Have you, Ms. Shotter, raised about this? This is in relation to the expansion of the wastewater treatment works and where the water essentially goes from that into the rivers. Because the question, you need a licence. Southern Water would need a licence. In relation to the flows in those rivers, and bearing in mind where the heads of the streams are in two catchment areas.
I stand to be corrected, but I'm not aware of that I'm aware of the procedure, but I'm not aware in this particular circumstance that it's a showstopper. Picking up on what Mr. Bedford said, I don't think there's a great difference between us, apart from timing. What we would like to do, very much with Lenham Parish Council, is get on immediately with producing a rather detailed master plan. I don't want to see more piecemeal development around Lenham. As I've outlined, issues. One, there is still an issue with the wastewater treatment works. There's an issue with the railway bridge. There's an issue with where two-form entry school goes. There's an issue with the setting of the AUNB. And I think the proper planning approach is an agreed master plan to coordinate future development. Thank you.
I'm just going to, I must have some people want to speak now, but we've been running for an hour, and I think it's time that we had a morning break, and then we'll resume some more detail on some of these issues. Because I think if we turn back to the agenda, I think if we work through the questions in the agenda, I think we'll come to all the points which are relevant, I hope. So can we just take 10 minutes and then resume at 5 to 12, please? Say 10 to 12, so 10 to 12 by that clock.
this was circulated.
Okay, can we resume, please? Okay, could everyone take their seats, please? Okay, first I can clear up just this a piece of paper has appeared on my desk, and I'm not sure where it comes from. This is it's shown as it's page 11. It's the little diagram at the top says Lenham Village possible option, but I don't recognise it as coming from any of the neighbourhood plan documents or other documents that I've got, or the. Yeah, just wondering why it's, yes. Where's that one?
Yeah, it's that one.
Where's it come from then?
I suspect that the council brought it to you because they photocopied it for everybody else.
Oh, right, okay. I see.
So it's just a...
Okay, I'm told it's a page that's been taken from the council's submission, that's right, page 11, and I think a photocopy has been circulated, black and white. I've got a colour version in the original document, this was part of the, I take it this arrives out of the exploration work that's been done. Is it the same as this plan? Yes. Yes, okay. So this was in the document produced earlier this year, or the exploration of the broad location allocation at Lenham Village, and this is one of the inquiry documents, or the examination documents, 12th of May. Okay. Right, so I think just to recap where we are, the position is I think people will be aware that the submitted plan there are two central elements in it. One is that the broad location identifies 1,500 dwellings in addition to the housing allocations and existing permissions. It said that these would be delivered in the last 5 years of the plan period, 26 to 31, and there was a diagram in the submitted plan which had these two kind of star figures either side of the village as indicating approximate locations but in very diagrammatic form about where they might go. Now, in the proposed changes and prompted by some things I pointed out to them in National Policy and Guidance, the Council is proposing to remove that the drawing with the two star symbols on it, so that the figure of 1,500 dwellings would remain, but it would be 1,500 dwellings essentially at Lenham, and the Council suggested that some particular constraints, obviously not within the AONB, and the other constraints that were mentioned earlier, and also concern about maintaining the gap between, or maintaining a gap between Harwich and Lenham as particular issues, but not as previously. I think that they indicated they previously resisted development south of the railway, and that's no longer the case. So that the exploration work considered has come up with some ideas about developing some land east and west and some land south of the railway, but the plan is not going to allocate those sites or the the allocation would have to come in another development plan document. Now, that could either be the neighbourhood plan, or it can be a new plan adopted by the council. The council was talking about a development plan document, a DPD. I think in a situation where the submitted plan is a full local plan for the borough, in other words, it's a policy for every part of the borough already, and doesn't itself identify any areas for subsidiary plans, action area plans or anything like that. I would say that the status of that plan would essentially be a partial review of the local plan. It would be an area-based partial review, rather than some other document. But what I think some of the questions in the agenda have been kind of slightly overtaken by these responses and changes. And what I want to concentrate on, I think, initially then is this relationship between the neighbourhood plan, the local plan, and any further plan which the council issue, which would be by way of making allocations. Now, in any case, that the council is proposing a review of the local plan generally by 2022. So there's a possibility that if you happen, a partial review could be rolled into that, and it will be part of the same plan at that date. But they're talking about an earlier, potentially earlier date for that. But there's another issue, though, is that if we go down the neighbourhood plan route of making these allocations, is that what the local plan now says about the strategy and what the neighbourhood plan would need to be in general conformity with. And so one aspect of that is the number of dwellings. That's a key point. And there could be matters such as some of these constraints which are mentioned. And there's the issue of what are the strategic policies in the plan with which that neighbourhood plan would need to conform. Okay. So in fact, the next question on the agenda was on that particular point. So if we can just look at what the council's response has said about Policy SP8.
Excuse me, sir. Have you finished with broad location? I was rather.
Well, no, we're still on broad location. But I think we need to, before we can really discuss the merits of the broad location, and we need to work out whose plan it is, what plan it is that makes these decisions. Which are the decisions for the local plan now? Which are the strategy, and what is a matter that can be left to the neighbourhood plan? Because the local plan is moving away from ideas about directing how and where exactly the housing should go, and can that then be left to the neighbourhood plan to make all those decisions, or does the local plan strategy need to be more directive about some of those matters? So to come back to start with what Policy SP8 says now. This is the policy for Llanham Rural Service Centre. And it says that, I think the relevant part is that criterion 6. It says Llanham is also identified as a broad location for growth for delivery of approximately 1,500 dwellings in the latter period of the plan in accordance with Policy H23, which is the broad location policy. Master planning of the area will be essential to achieve a high quality design and layout, landscape and ecological mitigation, appropriate provision of supporting physical, social and green infrastructure. And then H23, this one. Sorry, I'll just sticking on SPA for a moment, because the Council's proposed change to that, I just read out, there's further scoping of the balance of development to the edge of Lenham and master planning of the area will be essential to achieve a high-quality design and layout. And then later on it says, housing site allocations and associated infrastructure requirements were made by the end of 2019 through the Lenham Neighbourhood Plan and/or a Lenham DPD. Housing sites should avoid major development in the Kent Downs AONB, significant adverse impact on its setting and coalescence with neighbouring Harrietsham. Is the, well, on the, stick to the conversion of the neighbourhood plan role first, is the allocation of all that housing proposed in the board location something which the neighbourhood plan could deal with? I mean, the neighbourhood plan that's been issued so far does propose significant amounts of housing developments, rather less than is proposed in the board location plus the allocations.
We are a really good, or we try to be a well-behaved neighbourhood plan group. We have tried desperately to find 1,500 places for 1,500 houses. Mm-hmm. The best we have, we also try to stick to a strategy. We have actually taken advantage of having an H2 stage, because we hope by that time, in 10 years' time, a brownfield site in Lenham, at least one, will come forward. So our current neighbourhood plan does not completely fulfill your numbers, and it has made use of the time allowance which we thought we had, which you now want to take away from us. We have carried out very, very thorough sustainability appraisals, and we have carried them out over the whole parish, because one conflict between our neighbourhood plan and your plan is that our neighbourhood plan area is the whole parish. You cannot, that's planning guidance, change our neighbourhood plan area. So if we find sustainable sites in the whole of the parish, this could be part of our neighbourhood plan. But we, as I said, we try to be well behaved, and we have not done that. We have really tried to find locations which are more sustainable than the ones which you have identified, because the ones which you have identified are, in our opinion, not sustainable. We have found locations on the other side of the railway where you really can use the railway. And this is in line with current government policy. So the housing number of 1,500, there's nobody in Lenham who thinks that this makes any sense. And we have really examined evidence, and we don't think that Lenham is the right place for 1,500 houses. Mm-hmm. Okay. But of course we know if you confirm this number, the neighbourhood plan has to follow that. We know it's a strategic decision. Thank you.
I mean, has the council devised this wording because they consider that A, it provides an opportunity for the neighbourhood plan to make the decisions about the allocations, and B, if the neighbourhood plan doesn't, isn't taken forward, so that and making those allocations, you want the fallback of the council doing it instead. So, I mean, I can envisage a situation, for example, in which the neighbourhood plan group do their best to identify the sites, come up with the full 1,500, and the site isn't supported a referendum, for example. the plans in support of a referendum that because people are it's a controversial proposals, and then the council then would be in a position of having come up with another plan which wouldn't go to a referendum. In fact, effectively, it would have to be just approved by the council. I mean, does that seem like a scenario? You have a shot then at doing it if that is the figure. The alternative is to say, well, is there another figure which would satisfy people and would more likely to get to be supported and approved. Okay, yes, Ms. Mackenzie.
Yeah, just echoing Henny's comments. We started off the neighbourhood plan, and the neighbourhood plan is about local collaboration, and the number of houses that the community wanted was more like 10% of the total that Maidstone were actually looking for. Now, whether how you wish to describe that is up to yourselves, but that was the mood of the community that we were actually representing. We have worked very hard since then to look to educate and illustrate in terms of where housing could go with the least detrimental effect on the community. At the last consultation, we got significant support, very significant support from those registering an interest in developing south of the railway, making use of brownfield sites where it was available, and perhaps some limited development to the west. What we have encountered at every turn is opposition to development on the east, whether because of the cross, whether because of the perception of the east, whether because people in Lenham associate with the rural countryside and acknowledge the benefits of maintaining the east as it is. As a result, we haven't got to 1,500. I would have to suggest that coming up with a 1,500 number to get through referendum would be a very significant challenge. Whether it's something that the Neighbourhood Planning Group and the Parish Council would want to take up remains to be seen. We do have, however, time today to debate the main considerations between the numbers we came up with, which are one cannot develop to the north because of the AONB. Mm-hmm. We've identified that development is possible to the south. We believe that reasonable development could take place there. We have always been against the east. We have actually seen some potential benefit on the west. The passing of the Ham Lane appeal decision certainly makes defending the west slightly more difficult now. But we're in a position where we've sought to identify the numbers that can be delivered based on the constraints available. So we have not tried to shoehorn 1,500 in simply because that's a number that we've got to put somewhere. And the community of Lenham has generally appreciated that approach. And we would expect them to still want us to abide by that. Thank you.
Yes. Actually, can I ask? Well, I think we'll get on to some of the. It's difficult to do this in this sort of kind of forum, but it's some idea really about capacity of the sites around Lenham. The AONB units have made some views about where they think where they consider development would have essentially least harm to the setting of the AONB. Perhaps if you could just again outline with what your thoughts on that again.
Thank you very much, sir. Yes, might I just take one step back before answering that question and carry on from where Mr. Fullwood left off with his sort of headline indications of what the proposed change to policy SP8 was going to be. That I think you read it out. The key point is that housing site allocations and associated infrastructure requirements will be made at the end of 2019 through the Lenham Neighbourhood Plan and or the Lenham DPD. Housing sites should avoid major developments in the Kent Downs AONB, significant adverse impact on the setting and coalescence with neighbouring Harwich. Well, as you might expect, we're very supportive of that proposed headline change, and we're grateful to it. But I would like to put that welcome in some context. The first thing is the change to say avoid major development in the Kent Downs. Well, yes, great. But I have to say this is a little bit like Costa Coffee advertising its latest product as not having arsenic in it, because actually nobody was proposing any development in the Kent Downs AONB anyway. So though I welcome it, I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, no, at Lenham. At Lenham.
This is a Lenham. Yeah. Regarding the setting, that's just the kind of headline policy we wanted. But I'd also like to draw your attention, so if I may, to proposed change PC 73, which is an amendment to policy SP 17. Now, this policy is being introduced quite specifically, I'm told, in paragraph 7.13.3 of the authorities' statement to this examination. It's being introduced to emphasise the importance of setting of the AONB. Well, actually, so far as I can see, that amendment doesn't do that at all. I've been through the words of the of PC 73 and through the words of SP 17, and all I can find is that the word maintained, as in relation to the value of the AONB, is going to be deleted. So I'm not quite sure what that's all about in policy, the proposed change PC 73, but removing the word maintained seems to me a step in the wrong direction, so I don't think we support proposed change 73. What the Council is saying is it accepts it needs to be clearer about the setting. Well, that's good. Actually, there's some pretty good stuff in the submitted plan in any event about setting. You can find it in paragraphs 77 to 81 of Chapter 5. And I'll particularly draw your attention to paragraph 5.81, where the plan picks out a key statement from the AONB management plan, which is that where the qualities of the AONB which were instrumental in reasons for its designation are affected, then the impacts should be given considerable weight in decisions. This particularly applies to views to and from the scarp of the North Downs. Now, this clearly is a policy in the plan which really matters in respect of Lenham, because all the development is being proposed at the foot of the Downs and moving away from that position. In other words, in or with the potential to be in the setting of the AONB. Now, it's absolutely right, as the Council point out, that you can't apply policies intended to work inside the AONB, outside the AONB. That's right. But the importance about setting around Lenham, where the policy objective must be to protect the quality of the views and the landscape character, that is a matter that should be pursued with considerable vigour in this location at the foot of the scarp. I mean, essentially, there's a wonderful landscape experience to be had from the AONB scarp, and development around Lenham should be planned to keep it that way. I mean, that's why we're giving evidence today. One thing I should note in passing in the proposed change PC 85, that although the policy change to the change to the policy is welcome, the reference to not allowing significant adverse impact on the setting has somehow managed to be omitted from the supporting text in paragraph 5.52. I mean, that's a detail for later, but we may as well get that right while we're going about it.
So, sorry, just make sure I understand that point.
Yeah, if you turn up the Council's submission to this session on page 6, which has got proposed change 85 in it. Yeah. You read out the bit in italic at the bottom of the first paragraph. Then there's the supporting text, paragraph 5.52. If you go down to the bit in italic, which is the new bits the Council's proposing there, you'll see it refers to avoiding large-scale development in the Kent Downs A and B, but it's missed out what was in the proposed policy change about avoiding significant adverse impacts on the setting. So I'm suggesting that that could be put back in again. Maybe it's just an oversight, I don't know, but we'd welcome such a statement to be inserted.
It's in the policy,
yes,
and that which is the important point. It's in the policy. Maybe you don't need to repeat it in the supporting text.
Right. I suppose perhaps the fundamental point that I want to make today is this, that I think after we've dealt with what we've done so far, that the headline policy approach to the AONB and its setting now proposed by the Council is fine, and that's good. But the problem is there seems to be a substantial disconnect between that headline policy and the detailed policies proposed in the submitted plan. Clearly, the Council is now wanting to protect the AONB and its setting, but the proposals in front of us are substantially at odds with implementing that principle. And this happens not just once or twice, but repeatedly throughout the plan. I'm worried that the Council hasn't completely, as it were, got the message about the importance of setting. Some of these items in the plan seem to us to go to the soundness of the plan, and we'd like to ask you to endorse formal modifications to them. In other cases, I think they could be dealt with by the Council making its own changes. I'll give you some examples. Clearly, the most remarkable proposal in the plan affecting Lenham is the proposed allocation of land at Tanyard Farm. We can come back to that if you want. Perhaps that's the best way of dealing with it. But so far as we can see, that if the objective is to protect the setting of the AONB, then allocating land at Tanyard Farm for 155 dwellings, is simply not compatible with that policy. You can find similar kinds of...
Can you... well, we'll deal with it now because it kind of illustrates the other aspects of this. Why is it not to protect the setting if you can see housing developments from the SCARP? I mean, what is it? Why is that not protecting the setting?
The benefits of the view you get from the SCARP along much of the North Downs at the moment derives from the feeling that you're in a landscape which has quality of itself, has time depth. You feel that this is has some elements of being a historic landscape. Obviously, there's modern things in it as well, and there's nothing wrong with modern development in a historic landscape where it adds to a feeling of continuity. The idea that you should look from the SCARP over a sea of modern development is contrary to the objective of the protecting the landscape from the AONB.
So you're saying Tanyard Farm in itself is a sea of development? Is that what?
It is a very substantial development which runs parallel to the foot of the scarp, that there's a long frontage to the scarp, and that because it's right in the front of the view you get from the scarp, it would have a particularly adverse impact on views and also on the character of the landscape.
And how does that differ from Ham Lane?
Ham Lane, I think it's fair to say, is a marginal decision. It went to appeal and it went one way rather than the other. But I'm sure you'll go and have a look at the site if you haven't already been out there. So, but the site west of the village, there is a much stronger vegetation frontage to the A20 on the west side of the village than there is on the east. That you've seen, no doubt, the report of the inspector at the last local plan who correctly described the frontage, the tree frontage to the A20 east of the village as very gappy. Another significant feature west of the village is that there's frankly highly intrusive development has already been permitted by the local authority immediately to the west of the lane, immediately to the south of the development granted on appeal. So there are some differences, and you've seen in the evidence other points which we and others have made about the differences. So, we're not massively happy about what happened west of the village, but we find the prospect of development at Tanyard Farm on the east far more worrying. And broadly speaking, you'll have seen from our evidence that wholly independently of anything the Lanham Parish Council have been doing, that we end up being supportive of their position that it'll be extremely difficult to get any significant housing developed on the east side of Lenham without significantly adversely affecting the experience of the AONB.
And by that, you're including all the area on the exploratory this diagram.
On the east,
these areas as well.
That's correct, sir. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That in our evidence we went through that, and there's some photographic evidence, and we would encourage you to go and have a look around, walk the footpaths, things like that. Another point is that we're rather worried that the council takes the view, particularly in cases like east of Lenham, but not exclusively, that mitigation can solve the problems which it's identified, to the extent that it recognises there is a problem of developing in the setting of the AONB. Its approach is, generally speaking, to say, well, don't worry, some planting and some decent design can overcome that. Our view is that from the elevation of the North Downs, particularly if you're walking along the North Downs Way, which is the principal pedestrian thoroughfare through the vicinity, that won't be possible, that no amount of tree screening is going to solve the problem of visibility or experiencing the character of that particular landscape. That so far as summer is concerned, it would take 30 or 40 years to get trees to a sufficient height to be able to achieve that. In winter, the effect would be massively diminished in any event, even 30 or 40 years hence. The volume of tree planting which you would have to put in would significantly change the character of the area in any event. And our view is that mitigation simply cannot resolve an allocation that would be wrong in principle. I'm not sure what the position of the authority is now, from having heard the comments this morning, about developing on the east side of Lenham, whether this is a matter it is committed to or whether it is a matter which it is prepared to leave to the Parish Council and Neighbourhood Plan to sort out. But there are references in the plan to development east and west of Lenham, and our view that is that if the Council thinks that developing east of Lenham can be achieved in a way that is that would not cause significant adverse impacts on the AONB, then we would disagree with that.
Let's just look at those references, because I just noticed that one of the proposed changes in the amended paragraph 9.6 is to delete references to east and west. It says land adjacent to Lenham's built form now.
Yes. Well, the question I appreciate that. The question I'm asking is, has the Council's actual thinking changed? The words may have gone, but is it still the intention that, despite the elimination of those words, that 1,500 houses around Lenham would necessarily involve development on the east side? Because we need to clarify just how much weight in reality is going to be given to the AONB. It's not just a matter of words in the supporting text. We need to know whether, is the Council saying, well, if push comes to shove, then we're going to have housing on the east side? Or is it saying, if push comes to shove, we can't have that number of houses, if that was the way it was to turn out, in Lenham, if it involves development on the east side?
Okay. Can the Council answer that point? You turn your microphone off, please.
I think the simplest thing to say is that the Council hasn't taken its final position. The point of putting in place a process is to identify the balance of options around the village. We certainly ruled out to the north because of the AONB.
So just on that point, I mean, does the wording need to say avoid major development in the AONB? Can you just say avoid housing sites in the AONB?
Because they're one and the same. That could be the case.
Well,
yes.
I mean, yeah, just
yes.
I mean, if this allocation is about allocating housing sites, and you don't think you need to do it in the AONB, then
that'd be
then
perfectly
say
acceptable.
So,
yes. Okay. The council is not putting an embargo on all housing allocations to the east. Indeed, one of its allocations is to the east. You've drawn parallels to the Ham Lane appeal site. The council thinks there are quite strong parallels. This site is not seen in isolation from large-scale business units or adjoining housing development. If you like, it's a very wide but nevertheless infill site. The inspector at the Ham Lane appeal drew attention to the wide panorama of vision from the Pilgrim's Way, and the same test should be applied here. Lenham is seen in a wider context, and the Borough Council certainly feels that the allocation at Tanyard's Farm is acceptable within the surrounding development and within that panoramic view. If that site were to be allocated and confirmed as an allocation, then in itself the development and surrounding employment development and so forth sets in context land to the south of it. And views from 500 metres away from the Pilgrim's Way are some distance, are to some extent filtered by existing vegetation, which could be enhanced. And just to take up a point that Mr. Bate has referenced, that mitigation isn't the answer. Mitigation in the setting of the AONB is actually one of the AONB management plan policies. as to how successfully to accommodate development. So I don't think there's an in principle objection to mitigation, reasonable mitigation measures to accommodate development in this location.
Okay, I accept that. I mean, you said what I expected to say, that that the Borough Council thinks development east of Lenham is acceptable, and for the reasons you've said. What I want to drill down to is, does a figure of 1,500 houses for Lenham mean development to the east is inevitable?
It's hard to be absolute on that, but I certainly think that it does mean some development to what would be more accurately southeast of Lenham. Lenham's quite a linear shape, and yeah, I certainly think it does mean an element of development to what I would call the southeast
yeah.
This sort of area here.
Here, yeah.
Yes, that sort of area. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, does this exploratory work, does that say for the area to the south of Lenham, does that show the kind of full capacity of that area? I mean, could there be more development south of Lenham than that showed?
It probably doesn't show the full capacity, but I am aware of constraints that haven't been mentioned. I'm not going to mention again the railway bridge, but perhaps more to the point in terms of land take, there are two woodland areas of sites of nature conservation interest, and obviously I wouldn't wish to see those areas developed, and I wouldn't want to see development cheek by jowl with those two areas of ecological interest.
I mean, I'm not sure if the study itself puts any figures on these areas, these particular areas, but I mean, just looking at it in an area basis, and it's difficult to to compare because of these strange-shaped areas. You'd say, looking at that these are roughly even, at the moment. It's roughly kind of 500 east, 500 the west, and 500 the south. That's what it looks like on here, at least. The implication being that if you had no development to the east, you'd only have 1,000 unless you can expand one of the other areas. I mean, this is in very back of the envelope sort of terms, but I think that's the general impression that it's something like that. And clearly, if you don't have Tanyard Farm, then that's another 150 houses less. But and yeah, sorry, and in the area to the west is this where the council considers that development needs to stop if you're going to keep your gap to Harrietsham? Is that the?
Yes, that's correct, and again, relatively early days, but personally, that's where I would like to see the location of a new two-form entry primary school, to use the playing fields as maintaining a buffer, if you like, between Harrietsham and Lenham.
But this obviously this is land that you're interested in. I meant to ask earlier, what do you consider the delivery rate could be on your site? How many houses a year could you deliver from a site like that?
I think, based on past experience, somewhere in the region of 50 to 80 per year, we'd expect.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'll take some time. You want to come back first, and then I'll take some other views as well.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ford was entirely right in saying that the A&B unit encourages the use of mitigation measures, but mitigation should be applied where development is the right thing to do in principle. In cases like this, where it's wrong in principle to carry out development in A&B terms, in our view, then the mitigation issue doesn't arise. I'm a little worried that the position seems to be that the council interprets protecting the setting of the AONB as including the allocation of Tanyard Farm and including, in all probability, or they're amenable to accepting it, a substantial development east of Lenham or south of there. I was bothered again to see on the mitigation point that the Council says in its submission, it's 7.13.6, if you want to turn it up, it says that regarding Tanyard Farm, impacts would need to be explored further and mitigation would need to be secured at development application stage. That we do need to impress upon the Council the very great concern that we have about the in-principle allocation of the Tanyard Farm site. So perhaps I'll just leave that at that point. I think one of the difficulties behind this, or one of the reasons perhaps the Council has got into this position, is that somewhere along the line in the evidence assembly process, that some information got misrepresented, misunderstood, misapplied. That the evidence is, if you go back to the landscape character assessment and to the sensitivity assessment which followed it, you will find that the landscape in the setting of the AONB at this point has just about the highest level of categorisation which it is possible to have. But I have a suspicion the Council is working on the basis it's not quite that important. And so far as it's very difficult to track this through, but it seems that some of the red, amber, green traffic light system for deciding where development would be acceptable or not has resulted in sites which should have come up red coming up as amber instead. And that's something which we're very happy in the months to come to go through this sort of thing with the local authority to find what's happened and what the solutions are. But I should say that we have, in a spirit of trying to achieve as many of the 1,500 houses as the Council is looking for, we have identified further land south of the railway, which in AONB terms, we can't speak in other terms, but in AONB terms would be sites to which the AONB unit would not object. Both west and east, actually, of the proposals put forward in the document the Council commissioned. So we are trying to be helpful in this, but although we're doing the best we can, as you'll establish, that we want to put our foot down regarding east of Lenham.
Mr. Jarman.
Yeah. Just like to respond to what Mr. Bate has said this morning and this afternoon. We do place significant importance on protecting the setting of the area of outstanding natural beauty. In this case, the Scarp Slope. But I think where we differ is that I think Mr. Bate then goes on to using the setting as creating some sort of embargo, almost a replica of some greenbelt policy where basically no development takes place. I'm not quite sure where the setting starts and ends either. I'm very conscious, as I pointed out earlier in the examination, that the Scarp Slope of the North Downs and therefore its setting takes up a lot of Maidstone's area. If we go to the west, the village of Harwich is even more to the north. It's, as Mr. Bate has said, on the foothills, I think was his term. I've talked previously about the northern part of Maidstone town as well. Inevitably, there is some impact on the setting. But going back to the Ham Lane appeal, I'm not raising this simply because it's an appeal decision. It's the reasoning behind the inspector's decision, which to my mind was not marginal at all. It was a very thorough analysis of an outline application for 82 houses. First and foremost, to my mind, there's a big difference to residential development and employment. The scale of residential does tend to be 2 stories or close to it. But more to the point, the inspector simply pointed out that, yes, one could see the site from the North Downs and more immediate views from the south, but that was seen against the context of Lenham itself and development along Ham Lane. Now, yes, there is still harm to the setting, but the inspector just put it in perspective. And as it's an outline planning application, the reserved matters will pick up on details such as creating vistas, etc., landscaping, etc., etc. As Mr. Fullwood pointed out with Tanyard Farm, to the east and west there is development. So you will, if the site is developed, and it wouldn't be completely developed, as I said earlier, I'm not going to repeat myself about the creation of a vista or vistas. It would be seen against development to the immediate east and to the immediate west. What perplexes me about the sort of embargo against development on what I call the southeast of Lenham, to my mind, it's less sensitive than Ham Lane, in that there is development to the north, the northeast, and the northwest. So I'm very, and clearly, going back to Tanyard Farm, but any planning application, a thorough landscape assessment would have to be undertaken with views from public rights of way on the North Downs, set out views from the south, etc. Thank you.
Ms. Fullwood.
Thank you, sir. Just to help you on housing numbers, you had a point earlier about whether the document we were referring to exploring Lenham as a broad location. Page 26 would help you, I think, to show that in this indicative arrangement, to the east were proposed 480 homes, to the west 420, although we've heard from Countryside of, I think, 600 earlier as a possibility.
I think it's 600 on their land, which may not be the same as the land.
On their land, which is different.
Yeah.
And then to the south, 600 homes. So, I mean, these are just broad pictures, but I thought it might help you get a balance of current ideas and thoughts. In terms of, just one other point to come back to Mr. Bate too, we have, and we've set out, I won't repeat them here, but and you'll be aware, we've set out on pages 16 and 17 of our submission the consideration of the landscape sensitivity, landscape character and so forth, which sets out that actually some of these sites and areas are of moderate landscape character, moderate visual sensitivity, and so on, very similar to the appeal side. So, yes, the Borough Council is not just taking this lightly, is doing a very thorough job at assessing and looking at the evidence available.
Mr. Mackenzie.
Just referring back to your page 17 statement, while volumetric
So your microphone's not on.
Okay, sorry, back with you. Just picking up on your point, Mr. Fullwood, yes, pages 16 and 17 of your submission do actually make reference to the sensitivities of the site, and while you threw in the word moderate, it should be noted that east of Lenham, Tanyard Farms judged to have high landscape character sensitivity, moderate visual sensitivity, and high landscape value. And indeed, as pointed out by Mr. Bate, that probably ranks almost as high as it comes. A couple of points I'd just like to make, just following on from Mr. Bates' response on Ham Lane. At Ham Lane, I believe that the AONB, or the Pilgrim's Way, indeed sits further back from the Ham Lane development than is the case with Tanyard Farm, so it's not necessarily the case that the similarities are the same in actual fact. At Ham Lane also the land slopes away from the AONB, and in terms of...
There's not a Tanyard Farm as well?
It's relatively flat at Tanyard Farm.
Because I thought I'd seen there's views of the groundwater running down across the site. There is a rise towards the A20, I think, from the other.
The slope at Ham Lane is much more pronounced down to the railway embankment, and to some extent that acts as a screening in itself. Mr. Fullwood used the words infill to describe development of the Tanyard Farm area. And indeed, there is development, as mentioned, to either side of it. Indeed, most people would probably take the view that the employment site, which is a site outside the village, is actually very intrusive visually, and much could be done to actually improve the view of that. It doesn't necessarily mean that we should simply have infill all the way along the A20 just to fill a gap because it's there. The Tanyard Farm area does provide a clear break between the village and the employment site that exists further out. I don't think that necessarily means that there's a requirement to fill in that gap. In relation to the setting of the AONB, I think we should remember that in terms of protecting the setting, we are looking to protect the views from the AONB, but also the views to the AONB. In relation to Ham Lane, there is no public space below the Ham Lane development, which actually allows the public to actually access the views of the AONB. At Tanyard Farm, both from obviously the Ashford Road, the A20, but from Old Ashford Road and the point at which the public right-of-way begins and runs up to the cross, you have the ability for the public to stand back and admire both the cross and the AONB. And I think that is a distinction that shouldn't be forgotten. I think I'd also just like to reinforce the point I've touched on it earlier, that Maidstone went to significant time and effort in commissioning the Jacobs reports, of which there's one amended and then a latter report of 2015. They appear to assign greater sensitivity to the Tanyard Farm area than perhaps Maidstone Borough Council assign themselves, and perhaps there's a need to revisit that aspect. Finally, I'd just like to mention what we talked about, a disconnect earlier. In relation to, it was mentioned that Harwich sits in the foothills, as it were, of the AONB, and certainly within the sustainability assessment, Harwich, amongst other reasons, was deemed as not reasonable for development because it was considered further development would have an unacceptable negative impact on landscape of high sensitivity or good condition in the AONB and its setting.
So you're talking about the specific site not in Harwich?
Well, this was generally Harwich.
Because Harwichham's there's quite a bit of development in Harwicham proposed in the plan, but most of it's south of the A20.
Yes,
but there was a site which is north of the A20 which was taken out of the plan. Is that the case?
Yes. Yes. But sorry, if I might just finish, Mr. Jarman. Certainly, there seems within the sustainability assessment to be, and with due respect to my friends at Staplehurst, Marden, Headcorn, etc., there are repeated references to landscape of high sensitivity or good condition being reasons not to explore further development because of unacceptable negative impacts. This is in doing the comparison between the various sites, whereas in Maidstone the language used was, in relation to Lenham the language used was there are some landscape impacts in relation to the setting of the AONB. I think one needs to play to the same rules in assessing all areas. Thank you.
Mr. Cockett, yes.
If I can just have a very brief word at the end, I guess, of the morning session. I think it's interesting that the Council, having commissioned these Jacobs reports, have consistently refused to use the data that is in as evidence. And I have been bouncing up and down for the last half hour, wanting to draw your attention to the bit that is in my written proposal, but it just illustrates the sections of the Jacobs report, which is the Council's only basis of objective evidence on landscape values, which they refuse to use.
Let's find your... one. Can you say what your paragraph number is on that? Oh. I don't recognise that in my copy. I mean, this is the statement we're looking at. Which is here. It looks like we've got two different documents here. Yeah.
In any case, I think.
Yeah, I mean the version I've got doesn't have that. And there's some differences on the title page as well between the two documents, which suggests that they're different versions.
However, this is which is from the Jacobs report. Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if the Council's seen this as well. Oops.
That's a genuine one.
Right. Well, that's another page too. Yes, I see that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's the same one, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Right.
Paper that's been printed from the website, and that certainly includes it.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd like to see that as well.
I suppose you put an electronic version and a hard copy version as well, did you?
I've submitted a hard copy version and the website.
Right.
That's the...
so the one I've got, this is the hard copy version, so I think there must be... That must,
it may be that
must be
there
difference
are
between them.
differences
Yeah.
between them, obviously. But
right,
the essence of it all relates to the Jacobs report and the Council's refusal to use it when it makes very clear comments about what to do with this site.
Mm-hmm. Right. Can I ask the Council to deal specifically with that point then? Just to identify which area we're talking about, this is described as East Lenham Vale. So that's the it extends some distance. It's a very small plan here, but it includes the open land that immediately joins the eastern end of the village. So it includes that, and then it extends some distance to the east of that. Yeah. Okay, and let's see what that says. Mm-hmm.
Just for clarification, can just be clear on the area. Is that on page 156? It's an area stretching roughly from the eastern edge of Lenham to the administrative boundary with Ashford. Okay.
Yeah. And then it's also, it goes north of the A20 as well too, doesn't it, I think? And south of the railway, yeah.
If I may, so it's pages 17 and 18 of the Maidstone Landscape Capacity Study Sensitivity Assessment, January 2015, which is one of the core documents.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yes.
Hopefully.
It says on, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, our main point on East Lenham Vale is that it's a large area, and it's yes, it does include part of where we're talking. Well, we are proposing development, but there's an extensive area south of the railway line. There's an extensive area north of the A20, and we certainly, in terms of the east, we're not proposing development close to the boundary with Ashford. That would clearly be unsustainable in terms of its location. While I've got the chance, I must correct Mr. Mackenzie on the Ham Lane appeal. Obviously, it was an appeal because we refused the application. When it was reported to Planning Committee, it was in the form of a detailed application. And I framed the reason for refusal. Part of it, it did solely revolve around impact on the setting of the AONB. But part of that was clear views of the site. When one travels northward up Ham Lane, one would see the site against the scarp slope of the AONB. So clearly that was taken into account by the inspector.
Yes.
Just
space.
just before you close, so Mr. Fullwood specifically asked you to look at pages 16 and 17 of the Council's statement, submission to this session. And this is where there's a more detailed review of the opportunities for development west of Lenham, east of Lenham, and south of Lenham. To pick up Mr. Crockett's point just a moment ago, if you go to east of Lenham, it's paragraph 7.13.14, you can see it says at the end of the second line, moderate visual sensitivity. No, it's high visual sensitivity. The Council's got this one wrong. That was the point which arises from the sensitivity assessment, sir. I had some other points, but you probably don't want me to make them.
Well, where's the very high bit? Ms. Shotty, it said very high, but
no.
Well, where's that come from?
It doesn't. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
Just as high, I think.
Yeah. Just as high.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Ms. Shotty.
Okay, Mr. Jarman mentioned that Lenham is linear. That impression can only occur when you drive along the A20. Lenham is historically a cluster form around a medieval market square, and only the extensions, your planned extensions of Lenham to the east and to the west, will turn it into a linear shape, which is contrary to the historic shape of Lenham. That was number one. Number two, as we have talked about Tanyard Farm, if I may. Tanyard Farm is the worst site to allocate because Tanyard Farm is Grade 2 agricultural land. Tanyard Farm is in the immediate setting of the A&B. Tanyard Farm is in the immediate foreground of a heritage asset. Tanyard Farm is a connective landscape for the flow of groundwater. We have talked about that. And Tanyard Farm is important for the people of Lenham, very important, so I talk now as a neighbourhood plan person, because these people in Lenham have built this cross in the 1920s, they have looked after it, and the only view which Lenham people have today to this cross is when they go out on Old Ashford Road, when they go up the hill, a very popular walk. Oh, and I forgot to say, of course, the North Downs Way is there. It is one of 15 national, what is it called, the North Downs trails. We have 15 national trails in this country, and the North Downs Way is there. It is very exposed. It runs underneath the Lenham Cross. It is such a sensitive site. And you put 155 houses in there. Now, plant trees, and you screen the North Downs and the Cross out for the people of Lenham. And you will, in addition, we have the SSSI. Are you aware of the SSSI on the North Downs? This is a site of geological interest. It has a viewpoint from which you see the application site very well. I have actually a view shed in my submission. And it's the Pivington Quarry site. And the Pivington Quarry site tells a story of the land formation of the North Downs, also in relation to the land in front of it. So the view from the Pivington Quarry is actually really important for the interpretation of the quarry. I'm very well aware that Lenham and Tanyard Farm does not lie within the site, in the area which is protected for the SSI. But the interpretation of the quarry, of the site, relates also to the land in front. Okay?
Mr. Chairman, could we clear up this point about the landscape value thing? The paragraph 7.13.14, does that come from the sensitive study we're looking at, or is it from somewhere else, and why is there a difference?
The reference in page 17, on 7.13.14, is from The Maidstone Landscape Capacity Study Site Assessments, January 15. This is a much more micro-scale assessment of areas than the character area assessments that were undertaken the previous year, which we saw was a very broad area. These are very much site assessments, and in relation to the Shedlar sites, hence the number H03264. And
okay. So you're talking about an area of land which is within that East Lenham Vale,
yes.
but it's only,
Yes.
it's only the development site itself.
Yes, a different scale of
not
appreciation.
a description of the whole Vale. I see. And just sorry, we get the sequence. And which documents? What document number is that? Do we know? Yeah, just get the January. That's January. You were talking about January 15 as well, weren't you?
Yes, January 15.
Is that?
Yes, this is the document the Borough Council is using in its evidence, as quoted.
So why is the difference between Mr. Bates' interpretation of it and your interpretation? Well, can we just...
I think yours came, probably from July 2013.
Oh, that's this one. That's not that document. But that's the overall landscape character assessment. There won't be a site assessment.
No. Yes.
That's a document that states visual sensitivities.
It's difficult on 2 pages. No, 60, 50 and 50 and 51.
See if I can find my copy.
So we've got high landscape sensitivity.
Okay, I suggest we adjourn for lunch now, and then I'll find my copy. We need to, I think, wrap up the Lenham matters after lunch before we get on to the other areas. So if we resume at 2 o'clock, please. Site assessments was 2. They're the same month too. They're done at the same time.